Welcome to the second keynote panel of our conference. And the subject, our theme is occupation, racism, and resistance. And basically, structural background of a war post-October 7. What is underneath, what was happening, what was the struggle. We have three distinguished speakers. The first, our speaker is Professor Sornaraj. His title is Resistance of Power, which is very important. We keep talking about the right of resistance, self-determination and the struggle for Palestine. He is an emeritus professor of National University of Singapore. This will be our first speaker. Our second speaker is Professor Mohsen Al-Attar, talks about the anti-Palestinian racism in international law, unveiling structural injustices. He is Associate Dean and Professor Zhejiang Zhetong, Liverpool University, which is not in Liverpool, but in China. I make clear. And he has upcoming book from the Oxford University Press in the similar theme. Now we're going to learn a little bit about what you have been doing in your book. Our third speaker is talking about Israeli settlements under the Rome Statute of the ICC, International Criminal Court, which is basically ICJ recently clearly made the illegality of the settlement. So we're going to listen from him the connection between the ICJ or impact of the ICJ, hopefully. And our speaker is former UN Special Rapporteur on occupied territories, which is between 2016 and 2022. We were together special rapporteurs with my dear friend and comrade. And also, he's also emeritus professor of Western University, and he's also labor lawyer. So let me start from Professor Sornaraja for her presentation.
It's the routine practice I have noticed of all speakers to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting them to this conference. In my case, I must thank them for allowing me to stray into a conference on a subject on which I'm not a noted person. My principal subject has been the international law on foreign investment. The object of my research has been to show that the growth of this area of the law has been greatly influenced by the power not of states, but of multinational corporations and of the increasingly smaller group of the very rich in the world. So the law is something that is created by individuals or by corporations in order to serve their interests and ensure that the investments that they make are protected in the developing countries, which are the sources of resources and of labor that enables the production of their materials which are sold in the different markets of the world. So power becomes a central feature in the understanding of the law on foreign investment, on which I have done most of my work. I have strayed into this subject relating to the Middle East, relating to Palestine, because of the fact that you find the same situation being repeated in this area. This area, again, is replete with power, not of states, but of individuals. As much as with the multinational corporations, the power of individuals in the creation of both Israel and the modern problem is very significant. So if you look at the history of Palestine, or of Israel, you would find that it was initially the thoughts of just one man, Theodor Herzl, which created the notion of a Jewish home for the people of that particular religion and race who were in Europe. He said that his hope was to create a rampart of Europe against Asia. I'm sorry, I can't read that. Outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. So here you have a project outlined by an individual, Theodor Herzl, that spoke in rather racist terms that existed at that time. After all, the object of colonialism was to spread the standard of civilization of Europe to the uncivilized people of Asia and Africa, hiding the obvious truth that both India and China were the cradles of human civilization, as were parts of Africa and the Middle East. So here we start with a fiction that the object of international law is to ensure that there is colonialism and that the promotion of a standard of civilization is the basis of the principles of international law, which justifies the conquest of much of Africa and Asia, and later, of course, the settlement of Palestine. The World Zionist movement then starts with individuals and is fostered by individuals. So you take, for example, the philosophy that is propounded by a man called Jabotinsky, an extremist philosophy that requires the use of violence in order to ensure that the people of Palestine are driven out of Palestine so that there could be the creation of a new state. So the ideology that is central to this Zionist movement has already been formulated in the late 19th century by men like Theodor Herzl and Jabotinsky. And the direct descent of the later leaders of the Zionist movement, and particularly of Israel, can be traced to the views that have been expressed, particularly by the extremist writings, in the extremist writings of Jabotinsky. People like Begin, Sharon, Netanyahu are disciples of this man, and you find the same thinking, the racist thinking and the biblical thinking that influenced these early Zionist leaders, continuing to influence the present leaders of Israel. So when Netanyahu speaks to the Congress and talks about Israel being an outpost of civilization, the protection of Western civilization as there being the outpost of a culture that needs to be protected against barbarians, you have to sort of think back to the origins of the Zionist movement. So the displacement that takes place is a project that had been articulated from pretty early times. And when you talk, when Netanyahu talks about Amalek, makes references to the Bible, again, there is a throwback to ideas that had been expressed from the late 19th century. And of course, there is a lot of falsehood in the creation of international law itself. Here, for example, you find that in all settler colonial countries, there is the idea of the countries being terra nullius, or occupied by no persons. So you find the colonization of Australia by the English, based on the idea that Australia is unoccupied country, that it is terra nullius in which no people live, ignoring the fact that the Aboriginal people, the dark-skinned Aboriginal people, have been living in Australia for a long period of time. And as always happens, when there's settler colonialism, it is followed by genocide in order to ensure that the existing people are wiped out. So I was teaching, my first teaching appointment was at the University of Tasmania. I was there as a university lecturer for about 8 years, and that was the country in which a whole race, a unique Aboriginal race, the Tasmanian Aborigines, were wiped out. They were simply killed off. So the world's most complete genocide, a total genocide, took place in Tasmania, because it's much forgotten about in current discussions of genocide. But the fact is that in every situation where there's settler colonialism, you would find that being followed by genocide. And as I argued, the notions of settler colonialism and the lies that are perpetrated in settler colonialism are repeated over and over again. So when you talk in terms of, the Zionists talk in terms of a land for a people, for a land without people, for a people without land, in justification of the settling of Israel, you would find the same justification stated for the origin of the colony of Australia, the idea that it was terra nullius, not occupied by any human beings. So there's a repetition of myths and legends that are the very basis of international law. So to a large extent then, I have in my studies on investment, as well as on embarking on other studies to prove a theory that I had formulated earlier, suggested that international law ultimately is an instrument of power that is used in order to rationalize what the people with power want to achieve, the projects that they want to achieve. And the best way of looking at the situation in Palestine is to look at it as a project that had been initiated by the Zionist movements towards the end of the 19th century, a racist project as articulated by Herzl, the creation of a Western outpost, to theories that were prevalent at that time within international law. So international law, so taught to students from Western textbooks as a neutral discipline, is hardly neutral. It is a discipline that seeks to justify power, is an instrument that is used by power in order to provide legitimacy on the basis of untruths, untruths like the standard of civilization. And also, when you see the history of the creation of Israel, you would find that, again, there is a manipulation of rules and principles of international law in order to give credibility or legitimacy to certain instruments. So you look at the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which is the most early of the instruments that on which Israel is found. You would find that it was really a declaration made by the then Secretary of State Balfour. It was contained in a newspaper, The Times, not in an official document as such. and it declared that that the British government would facilitate the settlement of Israel by the European Jews. And then you find other instances of justification provided, like the British mandate, which the British gave up voluntarily, is another situation which is full of illegitimacy, but is given as a justification for the founding of Israel. The partition plan, again, the validity of the validity and the legitimacy of the partition plan is open to question. So these are all the symbols of the early symbols of a hegemonic project that had been started by the World Jewish Congress and other associations in order to rationalize the creation of Israel through the settlement of European Jews and the ouster of the Palestinians who were on the land. This hegemonic project, as I have pointed out, is something that rests upon a large number of myths that had been perpetrated at that time. The fact that Palestine then becomes a colonial project, a project aided to a large extent by the British government and thereafter supported by the United States, is very clear from the history of the creation of Israel. So the situation that arises is a situation of settler colonialism, and it has to be addressed through the norms that were to be found in the alternative international law that the African and Asian countries were fighting for in seeking their independence. So you have the notion of self-determination, first created by Wilson after the end of the First World War. But it was pretty clear that that notion of self-determination would not be extended to the people of Africa and Asia, that it would not be the basis on which colonialism would be ended. The Wilsonian self-determination was confined to the redrawing of the map of Europe at the conclusion of the First World War in such a manner as to reflect the racial composition of Europe. Sorry, that gets magnified. Sorry about that. The idea then is that this notion of self-determination propounded by President Wilson should not be applied outside Asia. So what happens then is that this idea of self-determination is fought for by the people of Africa and Asia, by the Indians through the Gandhian movement through nonviolence, through violence by other countries. You find the Dutch fighting a long, protracted, and cruel war against the Dutch. You find, the Indonesians fighting a long and protracted war against the Dutch. You find the Algerian people fighting a long war against the French, and the South Africans fighting a war in order to bring apartheid to an end, both through violent as well as through nonviolent means. So I come now to a proposition of the law which the third world countries or the Afro-Asian countries had articulated at the time of their independence struggle, that the struggles that they were making through violence are wars of national liberation. Now, this doctrine, I think, is something that is hardly referred to in the context of the struggle for Palestine. But it is a vital idea that had been articulated in the context of this alternative system that the Third World was fighting for at the time of decolonization. I would say, as somebody who studies foreign investment, that the Third World was fighting at that time for another alternative principle that is embodied in the new international economic order that wanted to change the economic structure of the world, so thereby bringing about a new system that would govern the international economy and ensure that it is not dominated by the Western countries. So here there is an effort on the part of the Afro-Asian states to bring about an alternative system of international law. Not a system in which you work within international law, but the articulation of oppositional norms of international law. That you oppose them, that you prescribe the counter norms that would resist the principal norms founded on the basis of alternate fictions that had been put up by the majority Western powerful nations. So in the area of the use of force, we find the justification that is made by the countries of Africa and Asia that colonialism involves violence, that it involved an aggression against the people of Africa and Asia, and that the resistance of that violence, that original violence, is something that is a right which the people of Africa and Asia have. And that is the basis of this notion of a war of national liberation. And after decolonization, countries like India still argue that some of the armed activities that they had undertaken are justified on the basis of a war of national liberation. So when you come, for example, to the invasion of Goa, the central argument that the Indians make is that Goa was based on the aggression of the Portuguese in taking that land from India, and that when India invades and boots out the Portuguese forces from Goa, it is acting in self-defense. So this is the theory that is something that must be used in the context of Palestine. The notion of self-defense has now been captured by Israel. You will say that Israel is acting in self-defense, when in fact it is the other way around, that there is a perpetual right in the people of Palestine to ensure that their colonization by the Jewish people comes to an end. That as in the case of the rest of Africa and Asia, that the war that the Palestinian people are fighting, either through violence or through non-violent means, involves a war of national liberation which entitles them to a right of self-defense, a perpetual right of self-defense until the ending of colonial rule in Palestine. So the idea that Palestine is in the gift of Israel is such a misconception. What people have been taught to think of is that this two-state solution somehow depends upon the consent of Israel, when in fact every instrument, as I have argued before, relating to the creation of Israel is founded on an illegality. And of course, I have argued that if you adopt the doctrine of the war relating to national liberation, then the current struggle of the Palestinian people is very similar, entirely similar to the struggle of the African and Asian countries for their independence from colonial rule. So to that extent, then, one would then argue that there should be a return to these alternative principles that have been suggested by the African and Asian countries during their independence struggles. It is true that there is some progress that has been made, for example, in recent times, like the Genocide Convention, and many have spoken about the plus factors that have emerged from the activities before the International Court of Justice, the fact that they have declared that there has been discrimination, and from it we draw the notion of apartheid from so there are plus factors. But the point that I make is that these are factors that you draw from within international law, by standing inside international law, forgetting the fact that there are a host number of factors that are not covered by the Genocide Convention. So my argument is that we would be much better off as people who are concerned with the struggle of self-determination to assimilate it to the situation of the African and Asian states fighting for independence and have recourse to the doctrine relating to the wars of national liberation in articulating the central idea that the fight for Palestine is based on the right of self-defense of the Palestinian people. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for Professor Sornarajas. He reminded us how State of Israel was established after Second World War, and even goes all the way to today's Netanyahu's speech is Western civilization versus against the rest, and then bringing larger picture of the self-determination against the settler colonialism. The many countries in Africa and Asia and Israel and Palestine is maybe the last example of this struggle. Now we are coming with Professor Mohsen Attar, going further how racism also made this Palestinian struggle is deeper and parallel to other racist societies. Thank you. Please.
Gabriel Garcia Marquez was one of the great authors of the 20th century. He's a Colombian writer, renowned for his friendship with Fidel Castro and for his contribution to the genre known as magic realism. Probably his most renowned book is what's called 100 Years of Solitude, a book set in the village of Moncado. It follows several generations then as the community transforms. There's a character in the book by the name of Remedios the Beauty. Remedios the Beauty unexpectedly waves farewell to her family and floats off into the clouds. For those who have read the book, this is a very peculiar twist. And this is a peculiar twist because there was nothing to suggest that Remedios could fly, that she could levitate, that she was some type of spirit. So a journalist one day, several years later, asked Marquez, what happened to Remedios? And Marquez said, for the tale to continue, Remedios had to die, but I had fallen in love with her, and I couldn't wield the knife. So I sent her to the heavens, where I hope she still is. This is a fascinating tale about knowledge, about epistemology, about the way we create knowledge in unique and culturally specific ways. And I want you to remember the clouds, because the clouds will return at the very end of this talk in relation then to Palestinians. What can we learn about international law from Marquez and from Remedios? The world is populated with many thoughts about international law, with many epistemologies, and many of these are unwelcome within international law. There are gatekeepers who ensure that the narrative remains the same. And we are often told, and I think I even heard it at this conference, that the world is better with international law than without it. And that I find this statement epistemically flawed. Why? First, it assumes that international law is neutral, that it is benevolent, philanthropic. And yet the history of international law is bathed in the blood of third world peoples. International law has been used to justify the transatlantic slave trade. It has been used to justify colonization of Africa. It has been used to justify the exploitation of workers across the planet. It has been used to justify assassinations, sovereign debt, and of course, the dispossession of the Palestinians. The second epistemic flaw in that statement about the world being better with international law is that it assumes a relationship between international law and justice, while at the same time masking the ideological and material role that international law plays in preserving a very unequal and unjust status quo. Now, this conference is entitled Rethinking International Law, and I would like to propose that we approach thought, that we approach cognition, we approach knowledge and epistemology from an epistemologically plural perspective. Let us expand the boundaries of international law, and let us include the knowledge and experiences of non-white peoples. I will proceed in three parts now. I'll begin by making some general remarks about international law, about TWAIL, Third World Approaches to International Law, and about a concept known as white ignorance. Afterwards, I will speak about the racism that is embedded within international law, including specifically anti-Palestinian racism. And then in the final part, I will link international law to domination. I will then link domination to resistance, and I will link resistance to Palestinian dignity. And I will do all of that in 18 minutes.
Do it.
Now, the foundation of international law is similar to the foundation of modernity. It is steeped in racism, anti-black racism, anti-Muslim racism, anti-Ottoman racism. Those of you who have read Tony Anghie's fantastic book will remember Vittoria's speech and will remember that Vittoria, in addition to singling out indigenous peoples, also singled out the Saracens and said explicitly that the Saracens were incapable, intrinsically, of ever waging a just war. White supremacy is at the foundation of international law. We see it in Vittoria, we see it in Grotius, we see it in Vattel, we see it in Lorimer, in Lauterpacht, in Westlake, in Oppenheimer. The list goes on and on. But don't just take my word for it. Let's look at what John Westlake, professor of international law at Cambridge, has said. The international society which develops international law is composed of all the states of European blood, that is, of all the European and American states, except Turkey. He goes on and says, once he was made president of the Institut de Droit International, it is the international society of the white race. This was just a few generations ago. By the mid-1950s, Westlake would have been quite disappointed, had he been around to see it. The idea of overt racism was no longer fashionable. And it presented a conundrum then for international legal scholars. How do we nurture normative commitment to international law, including the predatory racism upon which the whole system was fashioned by the very people who were brutalized by it? How do we get decolonizing, self-determining third world states to commit to a Eurocentric, racialized, racist international legal order? The solution was quite simple, quite juvenile, you might even say. We will ignore the elephant in the room. we will play ostrich. James Gathie published a piece just a few years ago in which he examined the scholarship over 100 years in the American Journal of International Law. Virtually zero references to race or to racism within a century of scholarship. I did the same with the European Journal of International Law. They did a little bit better. 0.4% of their scholarship mentions race. Virtually none mention racism. There is almost no mention in any textbooks on international law of race, racism, racialized domination, or white supremacy. And so it's useful to think of this exclusion of race from scholarship on international law through the lens of white ignorance. White ignorance developed by the philosopher Charles Mills. Ignorance is often understood as a lack of knowledge. I don't know. It can also be understood as an error, a false belief. I was mistaken. But Charles Mills tells us that ignorance can also be an epistemic position. It is an ignorance that resists. It is an ignorance that refuses to know, an ignorance that fights back. International law has been indifferent to the place of white supremacy within its operation. It resists any conversations about racial domination. I can see many of you in the room looking at me and saying, but what about the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination? CERD, aren't they doing good work? Don't we have these treaties? Isn't there a prohibition on racial discrimination? And I say yes, because talk of racial discrimination is consistent with liberalism, is consistent with modernity. Why? Because it tells us about individual wrongdoers. That person is a racist. It tells us about individual injuries, victims. That person was harmed by that racism. And it tells us about corrective measures that happen for the individual. But if I use the language of white supremacy, what I am pointing to is not just a systemic problem. I am also pointing to those who benefit from racism. And there is a large section within the world, in the same way there is within the International Legal Academy, of individuals who derive privilege from the racism that is perpetuated by the system. So the language of white supremacy, unlike the language of racial discrimination, forces us to engage in a contextualized assessment of international law and not a normative one. And there's a fantastic quote by W.E.B. Du Bois where he says, "Awareness of the exploitation of colonized peoples would be fatal to Europe's high ideals of justice, freedom, and culture." How can Europe make any claims whatsoever to civilization if you've studied any aspect of European history? Now, white ignorance leads to moral and to cognitive errors in our thinking about the law. Knowledge is not neutral. It is oriented towards an understanding of the way the world should work. And yet we continue to shape that world relying on a Eurocentric epistemology that itself was fashioned in the dispossession and dehumanization of non-Europeans. There's an excellent quote here, which I refer you to. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, who said, listen closely, "The security of the people in Israel is just as important as the survival of the Palestinians. Their security is on par with the survival of an entire people. What makes that statement even more visceral and egregious is that it was reported in the media as representative of a chastising of Israel by Germany. International law has been a tool used to justify not just material conquest, but also a type of epistemic conquest. And this domination is, as Vincent Lloyd said, the arbitrary exertion of one's will over another. And its primal scene is the master-slave relation. Now, this master-slave relation comes up a lot in international law, without even looking at the topic of slavery. Within third world approaches to international law, we understand international law as an instrument of ignorance, an instrument of domination. The main question that international law has had to contend with over the centuries is, how do we as Europe justify taking the land of others? Now, the easy way is to use weaponry, but of course, I have to do this in a manner that legitimizes my own identity, my own self-loving, my own perception of myself as a law-abiding, humane, liberal individual. And so to do that, I have to use law as a way to justify the dispossession that I want to carry out. And how can I go ahead and justify that dispossession of others? Well, simply by dehumanizing the others. If the other ceases to be human, then the dispossession is moral, because I am doing it for the benefit of either humans or for those beasts who eventually I am going to raise to the level of humans. I give you an example. Some of you will have heard of the Zong massacre. Some of you will not. The Zong was a ship in which people had been enslaved and were being transported from England, then to the New World. Along the way, the ship captain realized they don't have enough water, they don't have enough food, they don't have enough supplies to sustain both the sailors and the cargo. So what did they do? They threw 130 people into the abyss. Now that in itself is pretty standard, and we've come accustomed to that type of behavior. But it goes further, and this is where the law comes in. Upon returning to London, the ship owner made a claim, an insurance claim before the courts. And they said, this cargo is valued at X, you must reimburse us X. The insurance company resists, but they resist not because of the savagery of the act. They resist because you had voluntarily damaged your own cargo. Now, what is fascinating is the ship owners won in court, and the insurance company was ordered to compensate them. Some other people who were there at the time said, well, these individuals were not cargo, these were people. And so that act of jettisoning 130 people into the sea was an act of mass murder, and we should bring criminal charges before them. The Solicitor General at the time said, what is this claim that human people have been thrown overboard? This is a case of chattels or goods. Blacks are goods and property. It is madness to accuse these well-serving, honorable men of murder. The case is the same as if wood had been thrown overboard. Twail draws attention to these aspects that Europe prefers to ignore. And the thorniest legal problems that we are dealing with today are tied to white supremacy and its afterlives. Consider the UN Security Council. There was talk yesterday about the veto power. Does anyone think about it and say, huh, that's interesting. 4 white states have veto power, not a single black one, not a single brown one, not a single Muslim one. How valid is sovereign debt? What about the validity of the Balfour Declaration? We are told that we must take all of these for granted because this is part of the international legal order. The Vienna Convention says so. The doctrine of uti possidetis tells us we must respect these colonial borders. International law proposes answers to 3 key questions: a normative question, a political question, and a sociological one. How do we regulate relations? Who decides? And who owes what and to whom? Normative, political, sociological. Meaning, we are dealing with an epistemological order. And the answer for international lawyers is what Europe preferred during the colonial era is the basis of the answer to those 3 questions. That is the epistemology that we must rely upon. Now this leads us then to Palestine.
Oh my God.
I took these photos, by the way, at an antiques shop then, just a couple of months ago. From an international legal perspective, there are 3 thorny aspects to Zionism. The first one, and many here understand this better than I do, is the nature of international law. The Geneva Conventions, the Hague Regulations, these are ill-fitted for settler colonial scenarios. The law of occupation does not address settler colonialism. It deals with something else. Zionism is a settler colonial ideology. Israel is a settler colonial state. And so when we turn to international law, we come up short in terms of the answers, and we are forced to deal with Zionism as a type of extra-legal ideology. The second problem with international law in relation to Zionism. This is what Vincent Lloyd, who I referenced earlier, refers to as the primal scene of domination. International law's foundations, as I've said to you on multiple occasions and that others have already demonstrated, is settler colonial. Vittoria, Grotius, Vattel, Westlake, each and every one used international law as a way to justify the taking of the lands of others. This dispossession was always racialized and involved the dehumanization of the other. We remain, as international legal scholars, unwilling to confront the foundations of international law, the very same foundations that enable the dispossession of Palestinians. How often do we talk about the legality of states such as Canada, or the United States, or Australia, or New Zealand, or Zimbabwe, or South Africa? In fact, there is an entire area of international law, international investment law, that was designed to prevent any type of accountability for the dispossession of third world peoples. The doctrine of intertemporality was designed to prevent any accountability for the dehumanization of non-white peoples. We can't hold you accountable because it wasn't a law that you accepted at the time. Now this brings us to the third problem, and this is what I will conclude on. The racism, the white supremacy, the anti-Palestinian bigotry that is built into the system. Some of you will recognize this quote. Nobody wants Joe Biden. Not even Mrs. Biden. I have no notion that the Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed. Why not? Why? Are they inherent, intrinsic liars? Intrinsically, then, deceitful? Some of you will read The Guardian or read the New York Times, and you read about Hamas-run or Hamas-controlled health ministry. Those same newspapers ran stories about 40 beheaded babies, about mass rape. Blinken, then, Secretary Blinken, declared that Netanyahu had provided credible and reliable assurances that they were complying with international humanitarian law. What about the 15,000 dead children? That is IHL compliant. The State Department went as far as to say, the blockade is probably famine-inducing. We recognize that. But it's still international humanitarian law compliant. Contrast that with the simple statement that the Israelis made, some people who work at UNRWA are connected to Hamas. And instantly, we defund the organization, accelerating the deaths of thousands of more Palestinians. White supremacy, anti-Palestinian, and anti-Muslim racism mean that Palestinians must contend with a discursive environment, but more importantly, an epistemological environment that treats them as presumptively deceitful, shifty, immoral. Now, this brings me to the conclusion. How do we understand the resistance that Palestinians engage in? We often speak about it in legal terms. Is this lawful? And we celebrate the advisory opinion, we celebrate the statement by the Chinese in which they recognize they have a right to resistance in legal terms. But there's another way that we can look at it. Resistance is tied to freedom. The goal is self-determination, but the goal is also dignity. And dignity is understood as a core concept of international law. But the dignity in international law is one that I would describe as passive. It recognizes the equal, inherent, and inalienable value of every person. Yet, we know full well, when looking at over 40,000 dead Palestinians, over 100,000 injured, tens of thousands missing, we know full well that that concept of dignity is fallacious, is fictitious, is a fraud. So instead, I like to look to what's known as anti-colonial dignity, or black dignity, or Palestinian dignity. It is not dignity in status, but dignity in performance. In this case, how do the dispossessed struggle for their dignity? And this is an idea then that Vincent Lloyd develops. And he says, bourgeois philosophy, white philosophy, naturalizes and mystifies the ideas of the wealthy and powerful, entrenching projects of domination. The second part is most interesting. The experts at challenging domination are those who have been dominated. Their insights are essential, though they ought to be treated as conversation starters and not conversation stoppers. What the Palestinians are doing in terms of resistance is living. And they're living in a world that is committed to their destruction. They are not the first to engage in this type of act. And some of you will know the great anti-abolitionist Frederick Douglass. And he described a scenario in which he fought back against his slave owner. I found my strong fingers firmly attached to the throat of the tyrant as we stood as equals before the law. This form of dignity is not concerned with respectability. This form of dignity is concerned then with equality in a world in which they are dehumanized. When we are reading, when we are studying, when we are deliberating Palestinian resistance, what we are looking at is the domination that international law perpetuates. The struggle that Palestinians are engaged in is ontological. It has to do with their very identity. It is sociological, their ability to live. It is epistemological. What does dignity even mean? And there are some fascinating interviews for those who can stomach it. And you can just go on some of these media sharing sites and you can see interviews carried out with young Palestinian children in which they're asking them questions about what are you going to do after the bombing stops. And they say, I'm going to read a book. I'm going to go to school. I'm going to see my friends. I'm going to see my grandparents. That dignity, then, is unparalleled. Yet the current system provides little support for those who are struggling against their dispossession and their dehumanization. So for the Palestinians, the struggle is very much then to imagine, to embrace a future where they are free from domination. And I mentioned to you the clouds at the very beginning, and I return to the clouds now.
No,
and I'll conclude with a final question.
Cut. I'm sorry, it's 1:06. We can't give more.
Yes, it's 1 minute. I'll finish with this. This is a fantastic then poem in which Kanafani says, I wish children didn't die. I wish they would be temporarily elevated to the skies until the war ends. Then they would return home safe. And when their parents would ask them, where were you? They would say, we were playing in the clouds. Considering that Kanafani said this 50 years ago, that we needed to send Palestinian children to the clouds then, that we need to send them to the clouds now to stay safe, I ask you, what value does international law have for them? Thank you.
Thank you, Mohsen. You started from criticizing international law from the world. I think we should open, because many of our audience don't know the world international lawyers. There is a group of lawyers from the third world countries, and they are critical to international law. And she started from racism and ended with a resistance movement. Thank you. I'm sorry, now we are a little late, but I think our audience enjoyed the presentation. Thank you. Please, Michael, last but not the
Well, listen, first of
least.
all, let me thank you all for the invitation to come to Istanbul, to speak at this conference, and to thank the many, many hands, both visible and invisible, who've made this conference such a wonderful gathering over the last couple of days. I really appreciate the hospitality. I appreciate the intellectual ferment that's here, and it's a great honor to be on this panel with these guests. My talk is going to be on something much more sort of straightforward, if you like, functional, with respect to the Israeli settlements. What I do want to say, though, because it's easy, as those of us who believe in justice, those of us who care for Palestine, to become cynical with respect to the aspirations of international law. And what I want to say, and I hope what winds up coming through here today, is the absolute permissibility of any and all of us to be skeptical about international law's pretensions. But I think it's wrong, absolutely wrong, to be cynical about international law's possibilities. We must not be starry-eyed about, in any country, in any system, with respect to what law can wind up achieving. I think it only ever is achieved through hard work, through lobbying of legislatures, through social movements, through the ferment of intellectual ideas coming up and challenging what is the dominant area of thought. And that in any domestic system, and particularly including in the international system, it always is an area of great tension between law in the service of power and law in the service of justice. And those of us who believe in justice, who believe in international humanitarian and human rights and criminal law, will know it always will be a struggle to widen that space, to be able to allow justice with as much oxygen room as it can get, to be able to breathe and push back against the forces of power. And this has actually been a good couple of weeks, particularly with the release of the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion from 2 weeks ago, and obviously as we look back during the past 7 months with the release of the provisional decision by the International Court of Justice back in January, its provisional measures in March and May, and of course the announcement by the International Criminal Court's prosecutor with respect to the application for arrest warrants as well. This ought to give us hope that there is life for international law to be able to be shaping the future politics. International law by itself would not bring the liberation of Palestine, but international law combined with its sibling, international resolve, is what we wind up needing. And people respond, and this is, I think, what has kept me optimistic every morning that I wake up, particularly during the years that I served as Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, is that international law has that possibility of being able to be pushed forward, that people respond to a framing that something is unjust, and they respond even more fervently to a framing that something is illegal, as the entire Israeli occupation has now been determined by the International Court of Justice. I'm going to be looking this afternoon at one aspect of that, which is the Israeli settlements and how international law has interplayed with this over the last 50 years, and what indeed can be done, which will be the end of my my talk this afternoon. So obviously, as we know, the Israeli settlements, which were begun in the first weeks after the June War in 1967, usually disguised as initially as military army bases, has been the primary Israeli tool for demographic growth, territorial control, and a claim for sovereignty in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. It is, as many scholars have said over the years, to be the single most important and visible feature of Israeli apartheid, and that's been confirmed with, I think, a close reading of the decision by the International Court of Justice 2 weeks ago. You can see the population figures that I put up there. There are now over 300 Jewish-only settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The 2023 population, I want you to compare it to the figures I've got from 2000. In 2023, in the West Bank alone, there were 517,000 Israeli settlers, and you can see the growth from under 200,000 in the year 2020. In East Jerusalem, where Israel had focused its settlement activities for the first 15 to 20 years of its occupation, today there are 235,000 Israeli settlers. There were 172,000 in the year 2000. And if you look at the Golan Heights, the population there has almost doubled from 16,000 in the year 2000 to 29,000 today. And one of the startling figures quoted by the majority decision of the International Criminal Court was that between November 2022 and October 2023, there have been 23,500 new settlement housing units that are currently in various stages of the planning system within Israel. And one of the big accomplishments by the current Minister of Finance, Benjamin Shmulich, who is also a minister of the settlements within the Defense Ministry, has been to eliminate 3 of the 4 stages of planning approval, such that it only needs 1 level of approval in order for an application for settlement units to be able to be approved. 24,000 settlement units for housing will yield at least 100,000 new settlers. If you read through the International Court of Justice's decision, you will see how heavily, in fact almost exclusively, the court has relied upon documentation provided by the United Nations, particularly from either the United Nations Special Rapporteurs, from the United Nations Independent Commission of Inquiry on Israel and Palestine, or on the regular reports given by either the Secretary General or by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And much of this original slide was from reports coming from the International Court of Justice, from the High Commissioner for Human Rights. But if you look through the decision that was released 2.5 weeks ago, you'll see the heavy reliance that the ICJ relied upon with respect to UN documentation, talking about a number of issues which heavily influenced its ruling, not only on the settlements, but eventually on the issue of racial discrimination and segregation and apartheid. For example, it talked about the transfer of civilian population, and it noted that there was extensive evidence, it said, of Israel's policy of providing incentives for the relocation of Israeli individuals and businesses into the West Bank, as well as for the industrial and agricultural development of settlers. With respect to confiscation and requisition of land, he pointed out the extraordinary lengths, and particularly in recent years, of more and more confiscation of land, both in the highlands of the West Bank and more recently in the Jordan Valley. And in fact, there's a very recent report that came out in the last month from Peace Now, which offers some of the most qualitatively reliable sources of information and statistics. And its publication, which was issued last month in July of 2024, Peace Now said, the term was, "While we were at war, the Israeli government's annexation revolution in the West Bank since October 7th. And he talked about the establishment of at least 25 new outposts, most of them agricultural outposts and farms, which meant the land takeover and the systematic expulsion of Palestinians from the areas, either in the Jordan Valley or in the southern Hebron Hills. It talked about the creation of dozens of roads stretching to hundreds of kilometers have been paved in order to be able to link these outposts both to the main settlement roads in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. More land has been confiscated in the last year than land all over, taken over with respect to the Oslo Accords from 1993. 70 illegal outposts already existing have been recognized as eligible for government funding and infrastructure, with Minister Shmulich instructing government ministries to begin funding 70 illegal outposts, established government buildings, and connecting them to all of the utilities that would be offered to settlements elsewhere. And another headline coming from Salon said that, and this is published this time last month, at the beginning of July, said that Israel has approved the largest Palestinian West Bank land grab in 3 decades. Going on in terms of some of the other elements which had influenced the International Court of Justice had to do with the exploitation of natural resources, including water, including minerals. And as we know, it's embedded in international law with respect to the declarations of 1970 with respect to control over one's resources and the ability of countries, as part of their right of self-determination, to be able to exploit their own natural resources. That all of this has gone by the wayside with respect to the control that Israel has developed, that Israel water carrier is in fact selling West Bank water that it has taken from the northern mountain aquifers and selling that back at inflated prices, going back to the Palestinians. With respect to the extension of Israeli law, and this was one of the important points that was relied upon by the court to be able to show the essence of racial segregation and apartheid, that there are in fact 2 different systems of laws operating in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. One fulsome, democratic, liberal for Israeli settlers living in the occupied territories, and the other restrictive, minimal, violating international law based on military law, which governs the lives of the 3+ million Palestinians living there. It then talked about the forced displacement of the Palestinian population, and how increasingly the inability of civil society organizations wishing to be able to argue in the Israeli courts for the protection of land rights for Palestinians, primarily in the southern Hebron Hills and in the Jordan Valley, but in many other parts of the occupied territory as well. And this raises this issue that one of the arguments made during the spring and summer of 2023 in defense of the Israeli Supreme Court and against the reforms meaning to restrict the Israeli Supreme Court, one of the arguments made in favor of this is fighting for the Israeli Supreme Court is our shield against the Hague. If we wind up lessening the protections offered, the minimal protections even then, offered by the Israeli judicial system with respect to claims coming from Palestinians, then we will have no claim at all, no defense at all at the Hague. And actually, that is proven to be correct. That one of the, I think, central motives of the ruling by the International Court of Justice is recognizing how thin, if at all, the protection offered to Palestinian landowners by the International Court of Justice with respect to this. And the other point I wanted to raise that comes from the decision has to do with the rising violence against Palestinians. And of course, those of us who follow not only what's going on in Gaza during the last 10 months, but also what's been going on during the same period of time in the occupied West Bank, know that the killings of Palestinians, some by settlers, but by far the most coming from the Israeli Defense Forces, is now numbering around 550 deaths since over the last 10 months. And this is the highest number of deaths of Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem since the Second Palestinian Intifada over almost 25 years ago with regards to this. So all of this, when the International Court of Justice wound up concluding that the Israeli settlement policy is illegal, but also is a big contribution to Israeli settlement policy. So let me just take you very briefly through what international law has wound up saying with respect to the settlements. We know from the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, this was inserted. The occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it provides. This was put in there because of the incentive that arose during wars prior to the end of the Second World War to allow countries to be able to expand their boundaries, annex territories belonging, at least on maps, to other countries, and then populating them with their civilian population in order to make the return of land impossible. And there you see the rationale by Jean Piquet, who was the intellectual architect of the Geneva Conventions, in his commentary in 1968. I'll read this. This clause is intended, he said, to prevent a practice adopted during the Second World War by certain powers which transferred portions of their own population to occupied territories for political and racial reasons, or in order, as they claimed, to colonize these territories. Such transfers worsened the economic situation of the native population and endangered their separate existence as a race. So then we go forward, because what I want to be able to draw for you today is it's been long established that the Israeli settlements are illegal as a violation, a flagrant violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. But what was not said even in the International Court of Justice's decision 2 weeks ago was the question of war crimes. Are the Israeli settlements a war crime? Which elevates the seriousness of these settlement enterprise in the annals of international law. So beginning in 1977, when there were amendments and a movement meant to modernize the Geneva Conventions, in the first protocol additional to the Geneva Conventions, we have in Article 85, subsection 4, a series of definitions of what are grave breaches of international humanitarian law, which includes taking word for word, just about, from the definition back in 1949, the transfer by the occupying power of parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. So why is that important? Did it just merely repeat what it already had established 30 years ago? Well, no, because then in section 85(5), it says, without prejudice to the application of the conventions in this protocol, grave breaches in these instruments shall be regarded as war crimes. So we already had war crimes now on the agenda of the international community, embedded into international humanitarian law. And then we had that, if you like, at least the illegality aspect of it, solidified in 1980. There were a series of resolutions passed in the aftermath of the Camp David Accord with the support, passive and sometimes active support, of the Carter administration, which was the last administration in the United States that take international law seriously with respect to Israel and Palestine. So, sorry, I've gone forward. There we go. So it passes Resolution 465 in March of 1980, which says that the policies and practices of Israel in settling its civilian population into the occupied territories is a flagrant violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. So the language becomes more stern, more exacting, and the resolution goes on to say that the Security Council of the United Nations, the highest deliberative body in the international system, strongly deplores the continuation and persistence of Israel in pursuing these policies and practices, and calls upon Israel to rescind these measures, dismantle the existing settlements, and particularly to cease on an urgent basis the establishment, construction, and planning of these settlements in the Arab territories occupied since 1967. And then it calls upon all states not to provide Israel with any assistance. So that demand, if you like, is over 44 years old with respect to ceasing all relationships with Israel that could wind up aiding or assisting or abetting the Israeli settlements. The last time that the Security Council passed a resolution critical of Israel on any matter was in December 2016, in the last 3 weeks of the Obama administration, when it passed Resolution 2334, and it repeated the formulation that the Israeli settlements constitute a flagrant violation under international law. It reiterates its demand, made over 40 years, that Israel immediately and completely cease all settlement activity. It calls upon all states, as it did in 1980, to distinguish in the relevant dealings between the territories of the State of Israel and the territories occupied since 1967. So just let me give you a couple of statistics with respect to this. When Resolution 465 was passed in March of 1980, and I'm using only West Bank settlement figures because they're easier to be able to obtain. Does anybody know, as a rough guess, how many settlers were in the West Bank in 1980 when this urgent resolution was passed by the Security Council? What would you guess? Victor? 50? 1-5? Okay, well, Victor, you know too much. You're very close, okay? I shouldn't have asked you. There were 12,500 settlers in the West Bank as of 1980. By 1993, when the Oslo Accords were signed, there were 116,000 settlers in the West Bank. By year 2000, when Camp David talks were conducted and then failed, there were 198,000 settlers in the West Bank. By 2014, when the last of the serious peace negotiations were conducted under John Kerry and failed, there were 370,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank. In 2023, as I said, there are now over almost 520,000, and it's estimated today in 2024 there are 530,000 settlers in the West Bank. Back in 1936, David Ben-Gurion said, and you remember 1936 was at the height of the immigration of European Jews fleeing the specter of European fascism, with most of the doors to the rest of Europe and in North America closed to them. And David Ben-Gurion said, what Arab cannot do his math and realize that 60,000 European Jewish immigrants a year moving to Palestine means no Arab state? Can we not say today, almost 90 years later, that having 750,000 Israeli settlers in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, with a growth of somewhere between 25 and 35,000 settlers a year net population, means no Palestinian self-determination with this route? So, if I just go back, just look at this last piece here from Resolution 2334 from December 2016. There's a request at the end of there, was the Security Council wanted to be able to maintain some kind of vigilance over the application of this resolution, and a request that the Secretary General of the United Nations to report to the Security Council every 3 months on the implementation of the provisions of this present resolution, the most important of which is that demand that Israel immediately cease and completely cease all settlement activity. And that's been done every 3 months on clockwork beginning in the winter of 2017. There have been Security Council General Secretary General has delivered now 30 reports for a year to the Security Council regarding Israel's compliance with 2334 regarding settlement activities. The March 2024 report, which is the 29th report, that's the most recent one that I could find easily online. It said the resolution calls on Israel to immediately and completely cease all settlement activity in the OPT, including East Jerusalem, and to fully respect its legal obligations. Nevertheless, settlement activities have continued and intensified. The other common wording I found by going through each of these 30 reports, no such steps were taken during the reporting period as settlement activities continued. So we have, if you like, in this passive, antiseptic, almost disembodied voice coming from the UN Secretary General or his representative of Israel's utter failure to the Security Council of its willingness to obey Resolution 2334. So let's dive a little bit in the minutes that I have with respect to war crimes. We already have the protocols additional of the Geneva Conventions in 1977 saying that settlement activity by the occupying power in occupied territory is a grave breach amounting to a war crime. Now we have the Rome Statute of 1998, which says the transfer, directly or indirectly, by the occupying power of parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies is part of the definition of war crime. And then, in fact, what was produced afterwards was a test for determining whether an occupying power was in breach of Article 8.2b little 8. And I won't take you through it, but in my 2021 report as Special Rapporteur to the UN Human Rights Council, I applied this governing test that the preparatory committee for the ICC had developed and found that Israel had violated all three aspects of that particular test. And now the definition of or the willingness of those in official positions of power is now beginning to widen, who will say that the Israeli settlements have become a war crime. And this is the 2024 report to the UN Human Rights Council by Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who issues an annual report on the Israeli settlements as demanded by the Council, who says the establishment and continuing expansion of settlements in the OPT and the occupied Syrian Golan amount to the transfer by Israel of its own population to the territories that it occupies, which is strictly prohibited. And he went on to say, which I think is a great boost to these arguments, such transfers amount to a war crime that may engage the individual criminal responsibility of those involved. And then we have the ruling 2 weeks ago coming from the International Court of Justice, where it said, and after going through an extensive review, some of which I summarized for you, with respect to Israel's settlement policy, it affirms that in the light of the above, the ICJ reaffirms that the Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the regime associated with them have been established and are maintained in violation of international law. So I think what we have now is the fact that the illegality of the Israeli settlements, together with the illegality of Israeli annexation, de facto and de jure, of Palestinian territory, and the fact that the Palestinian territory is occupied and the protections of the Fourth Geneva Convention apply in full, these three are among the most settled laws or settled aspects in modern international law. And that's simply a list, a partial list of the respected international organizations who have taken a position to say that the Israeli settlements are a violation of international law. Very quickly then on the question of accountability. Accountability is the missing component with respect to international law. International law without international resolve is only going to remain words on paper until there's resolve by the international community, generally emerging from below, to be able to force the application of existing international law. And I'll be very brief with respect to these. These are three of the main components with respect to the international law and accountability. First of all, with respect to international humanitarian law, common article number 1 of all 4 of the Geneva Conventions of 1949 says that the high contracting parties, which is virtually every country in the world, undertake to respect, yes, each country is going to respect the Geneva Conventions, and to ensure respect. Those are the key words for the present convention in all its aspects. The International Committee of the Red Cross, the guardian of the Geneva Conventions, has said to ensure respect is not simply words on paper. This is a solemn, legal, binding commitment and obligation. Articles 40 and 41, I won't go through these in any detail, which came out in the 2001 articles of state responsibility. These state that states have to cooperate to bring to an end through lawful means any serious breach of international law, and no state shall recognize as lawful a situation caused by this serious breach. And finally, I want you to keep this in mind, because I'm just refer to it in 1 minute as I conclude. Article 25 of the Charter of the United Nations. The members of the United Nations agree to accept and to carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the Charter. So accountability, as I said, remains, if you like, the defining issue, the absence of which has meant that almost the very first issue put on the agenda of the United Nations in 1947, Israel and Palestine, remains its longest lasting item, and it's the item that still remains unfulfilled, even though the United Nations General Assembly has repeatedly said that the United Nations bears a permanent responsibility for the satisfaction of the question of Palestine in all of its aspects until it's been reached at the end. And these are comments made by Ban Ki-moon at the very end of his term as Secretary General, who talked about, with respect to Israel, that the tackling of impunity must remain the highest priority. I've included this statement by the German ambassador to the UN, who I found to be very progressive and quite different from the foreign policy of his own ministry, who said that with respect to international law and Palestine and Israel, international law is not a menu a la carte. And finally, this special rapporteur said that between international law and accountability, there's an enormous gap between promise and performance. And I said, international law should not be an umbrella that folds up at the first sign of rain with regards to this. So let me just end off with this. If the occupation after 13 years, after only 13 years, was already prolonged, as the UN Security Council said, and talked about the overriding necessity in June of 1980 for ending the prolonged occupation 44 years ago. And then it says it strongly deplores the continued refusal of Israel, the occupying power, to comply with the relevant resolutions of the United Nations. Then does this article here not mean something? Article 25, that members of the United Nations agree to accept and to carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the Charter. Article 25 has only ever been used once, to my knowledge. I can stand corrected. But in 1969, in UN Security Council Resolution 269, it was used as the beginning of the basis to unseat apartheid South Africa, because apartheid South Africa was adamant in its refusal to accept rulings either coming from the International Court of Justice, coming from the UN General Assembly, or coming from the Security Council, with respect to the fact that it must give up and end its mandate over Namibia that it had originally received on a trust relationship from the League of Nations. In the same way, if Israel can be now in violation of over 31 Security Council resolutions dealing with annexation of land, settlements in occupied territory, and the refusal to apply the Fourth Geneva Convention and accept its responsibilities as an occupying power, does not Article 25 also wind up having extreme relevance here? And it's something that I'm hoping we will see in the resolution coming to the in the fall at the General Assembly, accepting the ICJ decision. And if I can just conclude with this. In my report in 2021, I said the Israeli settlements are the engine of this forever occupation and amount to a war crime. An occupying power that initiates and expands civilian settlements in defiance of international law and the Rome Statute cannot be serious about peace. Equally, an international community that does not impose accountability measures on a defiant occupying power acting contrary to international law cannot be serious about its own laws. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you very much all our speakers. There was excellent section. Now I am in between of your right to food and the question, right to question. So, but maybe we should get one or two. We can't do it without question. Okay, Victor.
Oh,
Thank you very much, Victor Catan, University of Nottingham. I've got a quick question for Michael and one for Mohsin. Michael, it's a bit of an off-field question, but as a former UN Special Rapporteur, do you think that the mandate should also include Israel as well as the occupied territories, given that many of these policies, they emanate from Israel? They're not like self-contained. Yeah. And then I was wondering if Mohsin, if you could respond to some of the arguments Michael made about whether you think international law has any emancipatory potential or whether we're all doomed.
Okay, very, very short answers. I only ask one question because they are already angry at me that I accept. So, sorry.
Ordinarily, Victor, it's a very good question that you've asked of me, to think that the mandate of the Special Rapporteur should expand to include all of Israel, and would also, I would think, include the status and fate of the Palestinian refugees. I'm leavened a little bit with respect to the fact that the UN International Commission on Israel and Palestine actually has that kind of mandate. That they do look at things, almost everything between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. So while I think it would be a good idea for the mandate to be expanded for the Special Rapporteur, it's not as pressing in my mind, given what I think is the excellent work of the Independent Commission. And you should note, we should all note, how many times the ICJ cited the reports of the International Independent Commission in its decision 2 weeks ago. Is that short?
Very good. Very short. Short answer. No more another presentation.
We're doomed. So quickly, what I'll say is that I appreciated Michael's presentation because I felt that at the same time as he remains idealistic and hopeful, I felt that many of the arguments he was making actually reinforced the points that I had made, which is that when we look at international law and we see the way it operates, as I said, the Palestinians were earmarked for destruction. That is very much then what they're refusing, and the frustration that Europe and the United States has. Why don't you just up and die? That reality then is such there where we're trying to find ways to use international law as a bulwark to protect them, when at the same time it was designed specifically to dispossess them through their dehumanization. So what we see happening today, and the reason that Europe and the United States were willing to stand by, the reason they were willing to go to my country to try then to persuade Sisi to open up the Sinai, was precisely because they said, here's our opportunity to rid ourselves of this problem. So what I anticipate is more what's coming is annexation. I see that, and then I see a continued push then for apartheid. So I don't know that international law presents any salvation, particularly because what I do expect to see is that we will have this advisory opinion and we will push, and the Israelis and the Americans and the Europeans will continue to do as they have been doing for the past several generations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, all of you. Thank you, it was an excellent, thank you.